for being here. I understand it's a busy time of semester in life, as it seems to be in academics. Would you all mind just introducing yourself and tell me something that would be helpful for me to know about you?
Okay, I'll start. Kia ora, I'm Avril Bell. I'm in sociology and I teach primarily around in research around colonialism, probably also, but race and racism in terms of teaching as well.
Wonderful, thank you.
Kia ora, I'm Simon. I'm also sociology teaching colonisation, social justice at the moment, stage 2 paper, which is the first time I've taught that paper.
Hello, I'm Suzanne Woodward. I'm also in the social sciences, so I run the equity academic advisor role, and I work at the Public Policy Institute.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Adam. I work in the School of Social Sciences, doing administration, just interested in the topic.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Suzanne. I'm in politics and international relations and using securitisation theory and discourse analysis to look at New Zealand security policy in Afghanistan. So reduction of hate's a part of that.
It sure is, thank you. Kia ora.
Hi, I'm Mathieu. I'm on sabbatical. I'm visiting from a university in Canada. So I'm in economics, but I'm in the social sciences department over there, and I work on trying to see how we can sort of change the institutions to enact an actual ecological transition.
Nice. You also said one of my favorite words, sabbatical. I don't know what that is yet, but I'm looking forward to learning. So thank you. Kia ora.
Hi, I'm Lane West-Hume, and I'm recently formally retired from the sociology department after approximately 35 years.
Oh, good for you.
So now I go to what nobody pays me, but I also don't have to do anything in particular.
And are you enjoying it?
I'm having a wonderful time. I've specialised in law and society, but I mixed that over the past 15 years or so with sociology of emotions, which are taught over that time. Hate, of course, is right inside my interest repertoire.
Fantastic. Well, welcome. Thank you. Kia ora.
Kia ora, I'm Campbell. I mainly look after my 2 children at the moment. My 4-year-old has nosebleeds in the night, so she's waking me up every night, and I hate capitalism.
That's why she's having those.
Kia ora, I'm Brendan. I'm an environmental geographer, or critical environmental geographer, I suppose. I'm interested in power and how we make environmental decisions.
Excellent. Thank you, Kia ora.
Kia ora, I'm Erica. I'm a master's student in sociology. And yep, that's about it.
Yeah. Thank you all. I was wandering the halls a little bit of your building, one of the buildings, and I was really amazed and humbled by the kinds of conversations you all are having. It feels a little bit like my institution. So I come from Gonzaga University. If you know anything about Gonzaga, you probably immediately think basketball. It's usually what we're known for. Kia ora. So we are a small Catholic Jesuit institution. I am not Catholic, and if you know anything about the Jesuits, I can't be Jesuit either. But it's actually a kind of a fun ground because we're trying to figure out who we're becoming. And it's always exciting, challenging, interesting to be part of those conversations. And this is one of them. So I would invite you as I go along, please ask questions, help me clarify, whatever. I know that we're just under an hour in total, so I want to make this interesting to you, knowing that you all are doing wonderful work. And kia ora.
Sure.
Would you mind introducing yourself?
I'm Barbara Grant. I'm in Critical Studies and Education on another campus.
Fantastic. Thank you for being here. Kia ora. So I'm going to tell you right now, I have no idea why people hate. Isn't that kind of interesting? I'm going to... I know. Wouldn't it be nice? I would be retired. Pardon me?
You can get the vaccine then.
Yeah. Be retired or something going on, having shared, all sorts of knowledge. But so my discipline is leadership studies. As Campbell and I were talking, I tend to view leadership studies very much through a relational perspective, which is part of the reason that I am visiting New Zealand, is because it feels like New Zealand has been very cutting edge in trying to understand relationships, especially from an indigenous and a white perspective, a Pakeha perspective. I'm learning my language here. We in the United States have not even begun to figure any of that out, but a lot of my research has been with one of the indigenous tribes in the U.S., so it's been interesting learning, let's say, the New Zealand way and how the United States has been working with, say, the Sicangu Lakota, which is the group that I work with. Does anybody know where that picture arises from? Very good. Wow, you all are going to be really good. Yeah. So Charlottesville. What I always think are interesting about these pictures is how similar everybody looks in the pictures.
I don't want to go on about my 4-year-old daughter, but we were at this Bunnings or something the other day, where there's, and my daughter, she saw these and she goes, "What are these?" I'm like, "I don't know if I can answer your question." After Charlottesville.
Yeah.
These things are
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Love this quote by Martin Luther King, and what I'm going to try to do today is to deconstruct hate through a particular leadership lens. If you, and I'm going with the assumption that the vast majority of you have been thinking about this some which way or another, or multiple ways. For me, as someone that studies, again, relationships, I think it's interesting personally to try to deconstruct it through certain lenses that, say, help me drive into the psyche a little bit of individuals and why they create this shadow side, if you will. So you all are good. Where does this picture come from? There's a hint.
Well, that's Atom Waffen Division or something like that, is it?
Yeah, Domination Movement. So this is a New Zealand hate group, white supremacy group. Okay, so how good are you? Anybody? You've been like...
It's like a one star David Hickey diversity type rainbow thing.
Yes, very good. Okay.
Nice work. Nice analysis, eh?
Okay.
Yeah,
So
every time.
does it feel like a hate symbol or a different kind of symbol or logo?
It's
It's a huggy symbol
it's
for
a
diversity.
communal,
A huggy symbol, I like that. Yeah, it's actually a symbol for a group that works to promote not, I always get the language messed up. So they are a group that works against anti-Semitic groups. So it's very much a trying to come together unification group. I suspect you'll know that one. Yeah. Recently, I'm part of the bias team at Gonzaga University, and we recently had an African-American professor have a student walk in with his hat, and it has hit the local news. The professor viewed the behavior and primarily the hat as very much white supremacy, racist, etc. And so it's been an interesting conversation, not just nationally, internationally, but also very locally for us.
Plan.
Good job.
Backwards.
Okay.
Pussy Riot.
Say louder.
Pussy Riot.
Yeah. Or we would say movement.
Okay, yep.
Okay.
Aryan Nation.
Good. Wow, you all are good. Wow.
No, fuck you that.
Okay. Ironically, a student and I did research very recently using these 16 different symbols, and we did it in such a way that people could click, do we recognize it, and then what kind of emotional response rose out of it. And it was amazing to me how few people recognized symbols. So the top one, we also used the Gonzaga Bulldog. Kind of helps to understand your own mascot. Most people recognize that one. Most people recognize the Trump hat. I was amazed at how many people did not recognize the Klan or the Nazi symbol, or even the stocking caps that the women used during the march. So it was interesting. Did recognize two of our political symbols, the donkey and the elephant, from the Republican and Democratic Party. But even the rise of, say, the Libertarian Party or the Green Party in the U.S. that have been around for a long time, those symbols were not recognized. So it was kind of interesting what we do with symbology, too, around hate and just any kind of movement or group. Pardon me?
I just didn't know, I never noticed that the clan symbol has the Vodafone symbol in the middle.
Yeah.
Which direction does it go?
Oh, that's the right way. Yeah. It's the wrong way around. So much for
So obviously, rise of hate in the United States has grown exponentially since 45's election. There's just a couple of statistics. Some of us try not to actually say his name. It's kind of like Harry Potter and Voldemort, right? So that was going to actually be one of my disclaimers. You were probably going to figure out that I am not a Trump supporter. What I think is most interesting about some of these comments is whether or not Trump will publicly ever announce that he is very much in alignment with white supremacy. It's very obvious that his rhetoric is specifically very much in alignment. So whether he's smart enough or whatever to not publicly say that he's in alignment, he's obviously, during his rallies, very much speaking to that particular base. And we can see that in any of his rallies and so forth. It's very clear. What I think is very scary, so I live, again, in Washington State, which is the northwest corner of the United States. Spokane is about 30 miles from Idaho. And we have one of the, we'll call it hotbeds. Northern Idaho is one of the hotbeds for the white supremacy groups. And we have seen an 800% rise in hate activity in our area after Trump's inauguration, which is very scary. We might call it job security for some of us, but not the kind of security we would want to have. But you can see all sorts of stuff. So the Southern Poverty Law Center, lots of hate groups that they've been monitoring, etc. I have a slide, although I suspect most of you know about it, some of the resources. We even have, ironically or not ironically, people in the White House or part of the bigger Trump administration that are active white supremacists. Again, even in Spokane, we've had one of our local councilwomen has gotten in big trouble by aligning with one of the big perpetuators of the Charlottesville March, etc. So not just nationally, but locally as well. Even our most recent shooting, this was interesting to land in New Zealand and to hear about the two shootings in the U.S., again, very recently. And this kind of newer phenomenon that these white supremacist shooters are bringing on, I'm not going to use the term suspect, but this whole thing about writing manifestos and perpetuating kind of the next person's motivation, if you will. So all of that, scarily fascinating. So like I said, I'm going to try to deconstruct it a little bit through a leadership theory. How many of you have, by chance, heard of Robert Keegan in the United States? Yeah? All right. My emotions person. Fantastic. Thank you. So basically, Robert Keegan has come up with a human development model. If you've heard of Erikson or Piaget, Keegan's model is mostly in adulthood, so he does talk about early childhood. But one of the things that Keegan and his colleagues realized is that with all the great work that Erikson did, Erikson sort of ended at adulthood, so mid-20s. It wasn't until Erikson's death that more information actually came out, and thanks to his wife, actually published some stuff after Erikson's passing. But so Robert Keegan is out of Harvard University, and his theory of adult development is basically about how do we construct meaning of the world, and he called it constructive development. I'm sure that you've all heard of some other kinds of social or constructive development models out there, but I'm going to talk about this one specifically. Of course, there's a lot of folks that do versions of this, But this one basically talks about a vertical development. So how do we think more holistically about things instead of, say, one perspective? Oops. Okay, so constructive development very quickly talks about, again, meaning making. Keegan would say that it evolves over time, hopefully. He would not say, like, say, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that we don't all become self-actualized by any sort of means or anything. And that basically, to continue to grow in our constructive development, we have to, and I'll use this term, it's a very official term, we have to get messed with. That life have to give us some sort of very significant situation that challenges our personal beliefs, and we have to do something about it. So just because we're challenged and life tends to give us that, we actually have to reflect on it and see where that life challenge, if you will, clashes with our current beliefs and values. So Keegan talks about two things, and that's being subject and object to things. So if we are subject to something, that means literally that we can't control it. We can't even see it or understand that it is in existence. And for lack of better, it's sort of like being a fish in water. We don't really know we're in water until we're pulled out of it. And then we have some sort of contrast. So subject is that literally it controls us. And again, we don't even know that it's a thing that's influencing our thoughts, our behaviors, our actions, etc. So in Keegan's words, it's something that we are subject to something that has us. In contrast, if we're evolving through our constructive development levels, things shift from subject to object. And object is that we can actually control it. So just a quick question. Now, Campbell's got 2 kids. How many of you have kids or been around kids? Some of you? Okay. Some of you like, no, I don't do kids. I have to teach them. I'm going to run away from them. Okay. All right. So you've probably noticed this, for those of you who've been around children to some degree, or even reflective on your own experience, that what a kid could or couldn't do one day has shifted. So that's becoming, getting something object. And usually when I teach this stuff, I actually teach an entire course on Keegan's work in terms of how it relates to leadership. But the easiest thing to think about in terms of subject or object is, if it's object, I can actually literally look at it. I can reflect on it. I can, if you will, see it. I can actually even control and manipulate it, perhaps. And one of the other things that Keegan will talk about is that in the orders, that as we spiral to different perspectives, in one order, so one order might look similar to another. For instance, second and fourth order kind of drive from a particular perspective, and in this case, those 2 orders drive more internally. But they look very different. So my perspective in fourth order, even though it's coming from a similar place, it actually looks different. So literally like changing perspective. And again, we don't go necessarily through all of the orders. Matter of fact, you're going to see ultimately, and maybe this is where we can deconstruct hate a little bit, is that some folks might not ever move too far. Okay, so real quickly, I'm going to spend most of my time talking about second through fourth order because I suspect that that's going to inform our conversation the most. But what you can see by some of the other orders, like 0, is these are little tiny babies. The really easy thing about babies is they just do their thing, right? They are subject to basically the whole world. There's very little that they can control. They can't even really control their impulses, etc. It's just, there they are, right? And thank goodness for parents and caregivers, because we'd all be in trouble. First order, and you're going to see some ages up here, but understand that adults can actually be in a number of different places. And again, we're talking here about, let's call it normal development of adults. So if we talk about some severe neuroses or stuff, that's not going to work so well here. But first order is basically our younger kids, somewhere from, say, 1 to 7-ish. They don't have capacity for abstract thought. objects are not durable, all of those kinds of fun things that go on. So if you remember little tiny kids and you hold up, the napkin or whatever, you disappear, right? Or one of the great things about infant swimming lessons is you can go 1, 2, 3, hold your breath, and kids will actually hold their breath magically. All of those impulses, they just are driven by them. So they can't actually hold them object in this area, which is why in first order, kids just go for it, right? And why they need constant supervision. Campbell was sharing, if I can give it up, his 4-year-old is a little bit more work than his 7-year-old currently, right? Those kinds of things. Second order, and this is, I think, where it gets fun in terms of hate studies stuff. Second order is usually somewhere around 7 to 10, but we do have adults here, and you might recognize some of them here in a little bit. So in second order, basically, the world revolves around them. They are literally the center of the universe, and so rules don't really apply unless they get their own way out of it. They might create their own rules and ask that everybody else abide by those rules, but they don't have to. What is interesting in second order is that they understand other people have feelings, and they might be astute enough to say, pat on mommy or daddy's back if mommy's upset or whatever, but they don't actually really understand empathy. They can't put themselves in somebody else's shoes. So they get the emotion piece, but they can't actually be empathetic towards others. Again, very self-oriented. To give an example, I have 2 nephews, and I remember playing with one of my nephews when he was about 4 years old, and we were playing a game, and I'd say, okay, Bailey, describe the rules to the game, and he would give me all these ornate rules, and we were playing, and he would keep changing them. And I'm like, Bay, that wasn't the rule that you told me. And he's like, yes, Aunt Cam, that's rules for you. That's not for me. And would get really angry if I would ask him to stick to the rules, because that wouldn't let him win. This is also, I think, a really good reason why typically most people don't let their kids at this order date or do certain, let's say, social things. We know that there's not really a good idea there. The next order is third order, and this, ironically, was where most adults, according to Keegan and colleagues, land, is somewhere around third order. One of the things that I didn't mention yet is that the vast majority is why there are different orders. Most of us are actually in transition between orders. So there's some lovely, not quite this, some of this going on. But we don't bounce back and forth. Like Maslow would say, you could visit areas of the pyramid at different times and you could bounce around a little bit. Keegan would say, you have reached your ceiling and you have a floor and you're operating somewhere in between there, and that will evolve, but you don't magically drop or anything. It doesn't go away. So third order is called the socialized order. What is interesting about the socialized order is that we make meaning given our institutions. And I'm using that term loosely, but the institution can mean anything like I'm a parent, I'm a professor, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Catholic, or whatever kind of institution or that we might claim membership of, if you will. So we get everything from that institution. It's here we're able to think abstractly. We can actually self-reflect on other people's emotions and so forth. We can be empathetic. This is, again, thankfully where most adults are, so you can see where relationship can influence this and is a good thing. The most interesting thing, though, is our self-esteem comes specifically from the institution. So if I'm a daughter, I'm a good daughter via society and perhaps how my mother tells me that I'm a good daughter, all of that. I don't have self-esteem on my own. My institution tells me what that looks like. My experts come from the institution. My information comes from the institution. Gets interesting. And where it gets really interesting is most of our institutions actually don't align with each other. So for instance, again, and I'm not, but if I'm Catholic and I say, believe in the United States system of a more democratic perspective where women have the right to choose, suddenly I have institutions that are clashing in policy and practice. And so part of my challenge in third order is to figure that out. And usually what happens is I get stuck if I'm solidly in third order. So I might not be able to make a decision, or depending upon who I'm in front of at that given moment, I will nod and smile and I will go along with that dogma, if you will, or that rhetoric until I get in front of the other institution that tells me another way. So it's a very interesting place to be. So I'm going to pause myself for a second. So when you think of some of the rhetoricing that you've heard from any of the hate groups, does anything rise for you out of either second or third order? Or should we just put them all in 0 and call it good?
I think that those people who are in those groups possibly don't have the ability to understand other people's emotions.
Could you speak up?
Sorry, I was just thinking that I'm just kind of oscillating between second and third order in relation to trying to respond to that question, because it feels like those sort of people probably can't really empathise. These people can't empathise, right? Can they empathise?
Third order can, but second
Yeah,
cannot.
they can't. They don't. I don't think they would have that sense of other people's position, feelings, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, this whole idea of being kind of immersed in an institution and being a rule follower within an institution, and that being, I suppose, one thing that's kind of not in there is the comfort of that, right? But that sort of feeling of belonging and having a set of rules provided.
Exactly.
And values, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's very insightful.
And being devoted to something greater than your own needs, I'm sort of wondering about that.
Mm.
Is it a conflation of the self with the project? Like, is that what white supremacy is? It's a kind of my own need to be safe and on top. Is then kind of the project, because there is something greater than yourself, those movements, right? They seem to offer that, a place to be which is bigger than you, but where in fact it's the same as you at the same time, like you all want the same thing. It's a kind of weird mixture of own need and others.
Yeah.
Greater and own all at the same time.
Yeah. Well, and sense of belonging with human beings is huge, right?
Yeah,
We
it's
actually
really important.
are fairly wired for wanting to belong.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I sort of wonder about the sense of, I can't think of the word, white supremacy, this notion that people are raised with without understanding how white supremacy works, and the clash that would have with the institutions that they see and changes in the institutions. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
If you're raised in a clan family, for example, or whatever, yeah.
If that is
And
something.
then Obama becomes president. What the hell? Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. So no, all good insights. And what is most interesting about specifically third order is there is not really a whole lot of critical thinking that goes on here. And I think this is, for me personally, as someone who teaches primarily graduate students, is, theoretically I'm working with adults. But if I recognize that somebody might be solidly ensconced in third order, my trick then becomes to be literally part of their institution. That makes sense. So they might have joined higher ed as an institution, that could be one of them. But if I am seen as contrary to how experts, teachers, mentors, etc., have talked about what higher ed is to do, I might not be part of the institution. They could easily other me, if you will. So part of the trick is to become part of the institution for them, to encourage them to see me as an expert or whatever, which is tricky, especially when, they push every, say, potential hot button I may have been trying to hide. Right? So third order is an interesting thing. And again, when I think about, at least in the U.S., and what I know about the vast majority of, let's call them, white supremacy suspects or shooters, is these are typically individuals. So in the U.S., I think we're at 285 mass shootings this year alone. Last year, I had one of my students did a dissertation, and we were at like 325, 328. I mean, that's that's
By the end of the year.
Huh?
By the end of the year.
Yes, last year. So bloody too many. The United States Go team is leading in the world in terms of that. Sorry, that was supposed to be very sarcastic. But what I am reading about those individuals these are folks that feel extremely isolated, right? And that have been, if you will, inspired by an institutional rhetoric of belonging. So fourth order. I'll show you some numbers in a moment to give you a perspective about how many people are in what orders. But fourth order, what happens here? And this is where I have hope for higher education, because we got to have a little bit, right? It is how what I do for a living, and I like my job. I love working with my students. It's fantastic. I get to visit beautiful places. One of the things that happens in third order is back to that being torn, the institutional rhetoric or dogma or languaging clash, if you will. And what happens is the individual gets stuck in the middle of that clash, and they literally don't know what to do. And there's kind of two things that usually happen. The first is they become paralyzed, so they can't do anything with it. And the other is they come out of it and they go, well, nuts, that didn't work so well. And these two institutions, I may love them, but I ought not buy everything they're all selling. How do I start authoring, if you will, my own way of being out of that? So I can still, in fourth order, belong to those institutions, but I don't just arbitrarily take what they're serving, if you will, without any thought or without any reflection or deconstruction, reconstruction of it. In fourth order, I can. So here, I've gone from this external perspective, so the institution drives who I am and my meaning making from that. It tells me what my self-esteem is, am I a good whatever out of that institution. And fourth order says I'm going to rewrite or I'm going to self-author my own narrative, my own value set. And most of us borrow from our institutions at some points, right? We like aspects that we've learned from various institutions. And we start, in essence, coming up with our own way of understanding that. So we've moved from an external perspective more to an internal perspective. And again, I can, if you will, cherry pick some of that stuff. And I'm not torn in two anymore. I've realized that institutions are not always parallel. They don't always agree with each other. I'm okay with that now. And what is often fun about this too is I can detach from it, and I'm not, let's say, as invested emotionally in the conflict of it. So that doesn't mean, again, that I'm not invested in things like believing in activism or that I'm laissez-faire about things, but I'm rather, again, able to develop my own moral and value system and move forward. What else do I want to say? Fourth order. One of the things that we really work on in moving someone from third to fourth order, and if you've done any reading about student reflection, is we really ask them to deconstruct their experiences and their emotions and their how they make sense of things. And we use a lot of reflection, we actually call it diffraction stuff, trying to help people to dig out, if you will, where they got some of that messaging from, some of those value sets from, and have them look at it. And again, not necessarily with the intent of changing it, but rather with the intent of making it more intentional. So helping students be more intentional in their actions and their values and their thought processes. It's not easy. I know y'all are trying to do various forms of this as well. One thing I will tell you in all of Keegan's work and all of the research around constructive development is people haven't looked too much at the dark side of all of this. So this is where I'm kind of curious a little bit about some conversation here in a minute about what this might look like, say, from a white supremacist or hate lens. But just to get through it real quick, There is a fifth order. I would actually propose there's probably a sixth order or a beyond out there. Keegan and folks stop here, and you'll see why in a minute. But basically, fourth order, we self-authored. In fifth order, what we've understood is the self-authoring still lives in a world of dichotomy, a binary, and fifth order helps us start moving out of that. So we see the limitations in our own self-authoring. Here we can actually hold different perspectives simultaneously. So in fourth, I can say, here's my perspective and here's the other perspective, and let me look at them and what's working, and do I need to modify mine? Great. Fifth order is sort of like the juggler's got all sorts of things going on. None of it's good or bad. Here they move out of that dichotomy and say, really the right action or the right process is what we are co-creating together. Nothing is permanent. It's all impermanent. We'll probably continue to evolve and continue our process making, but this is the best we got at the moment. Let's go for it. So again, can live with multiple systems, see the shades of gray, etc. One of the other things that we understand about folks in fifth order is that very few of these folks are actually in institutions anymore. They move out of institutions usually because, well, let me ask you, why do you think that these folks would not be part of big institutions?
They don't fit there anymore.
They don't? Because
the institutions are too inflexible.
Okay, yeah. They don't fit very well anymore. Any other insights? What do you think people in third order would do with folks like this?
Get rid of them.
They would. They actually, yeah.
Intolerable.
Yeah. To people in third order, folks in fifth order look very laissez-faire, like can't make a decision.
Senior management must all be feeling really good.
I've often wondered, actually. It's probably fairly true. I'll let you do the research. Let me know if you want me to come back and help. Yeah. So fifth order folks, they find it very difficult to be part of larger institutions, much because of the stuff that's been already said. And it's not so much actually the fifth order folks either, but usually they're like, yeah, it's all good. Here there isn't the dichotomy of good, bad, right, wrong. There's the we're in flow. And what is needed in this moment is needed in this moment, and maybe it's not needed tomorrow. But it drives the rest of the institution pretty crazy usually. So this comes out of Keegan's book, In Over Our Heads. And by the way, I'm happy to share the PowerPoint or whatever if you're interested in it. Keegan's got several books out. If you have not read any of his, I actually like Immunity to Change the best, that he wrote with his colleague Lisa Leahy. The joke about In Over Our Heads, that was his first book, and it was published in something like 36 different languages. But when he made some conversation with his dad and said, yeah, Dad, my book's getting published in blah, blah, blah language, his dad said, let me know when it gets published in English. It's really kind of hard to read. It's also a little yeah, thanks, Dad. Kind of like some of our dissertations, right? Or my dissertation. Yeah, thanks for reading it. Bless you. But I think it helps give a little bit of perspective. I like pictures, so I think it gives a little bit of an idea of how all of this works. Here is the magic. This is about the adult distribution of mental complexity. And to give you an idea, 85% of the adult population are less than fourth order. So transition, and again, can be transitioning. That's what the percentages are. And you see about 1 to 2% are solidly in fifth order.
Something's really puzzling me. What's the empirical evidence for stating the percentages?
Oh, perfect. Yeah. A lot of folks have done research. How we measure mental complexity under Keegan's model is the subject-object interview.
Yeah, I mean, how do you get representative samples of... I mean, I know an awful lot of psychological research is done on university students.
Because they're such a great sample.
No, they're just captive.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
But how do you get an actual representative sample in a society as huge and diverse as the US?
That's a great question. We are doing more and more research all the time. There's a lot of folks that do a lot of this research. Jennifer Garvey-Berger is one. The other gal's name, just Marcia Baxter-McGolda has done a lot. But a lot, actually, most of Keegan and Leahy's numbers actually come out of the consulting. So they're actually doing it with business people. And we could say that's a whole nother interesting thing, but at least they're not the 18-year-old undergrad.
But it's another self-selected, privileged group.
Good point. It's a great point. Yeah, it's a great point. You're retired. You want to do some research?
Not of this kind.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, it's a great question. Some of the other...
I'm perfectly happy to take it as a heuristic model for thinking about the ideas. When I see it presented like that with solid figures, it seems to me it's a misuse of statistical technique.
Fair enough. Sure.
Because given the status that statistics still have, it's maybe a tad improper to aim to claim quite such precision.
Fair enough.
Just thinking.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's a great comment. I think where it's kind of fun to consider, so with that caveat absolutely in mind, is when and again, I have a captive audience, usually graduate students, and we walk them through some of the stuff. What it feels like is that these numbers are reasonably consistent with what I'm also finding, but that is also very implied, and I'm not measuring everybody. So it's a great comment and a great observation. Any others?
I have a couple of thoughts. One is that when you were this is all about the Keegan model, is that it is a model that's quite individualistic, isn't it? So it kind of puts a sort of it's the kind of Western sort of autonomous, self-organizing individual that's sort of at the apex of the orders. And I just wonder about how that's happened, because you've done work with Indigenous peoples in the US, and whether a model like this becomes a source of conversation around the implicit kind of bias towards that, that kind of slightly free of relationship. That there is some of that in that fifth order, just looking at it.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that, and that's actually been one of my questions as well. Marcia Baxter-McGolder has done a little bit around the constructive development model and culture, but I would say that's absolutely a place that we could do much better, and I'm not even actually sure that the U.S. is a place to do it.
Yeah.
So that's been one of my questions.
I mean, it seems like the principle of the constructive development is one thing, but the kind of specifications of the orders, it may be that I mean, if you then wrap the sort of the caveat that this is a kind of that these are the orders within this kind of cultural worldview, then it becomes a whole lot more kind of contained, but also more sensible and less likely to raise questions. The other thing that came to me was, I don't know whether you know the Peary developmental stages. William H., I think he was. He did this thing around university students. He had a captive audience of thousands of university students and developed, because he too was impatient with the kind of where the model stopped, and he had this model for university student development, and it's got some interesting parallels with the layers of the Keegan in terms of the moving from the black and white to the relativist, to the kind of relativist anything goes, to the more considered principled relativism. I mean, so there is an interesting. Do you know that work at all?
Just
it's
a
an
little
old
bit.
American work. I think he did it in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, out of student development.
Yeah. But it's got a lot of commonalities actually with what these orders are.
Yes, and there are other models that do as well. That's the fun thing about labels and theory is we can pluck it and say, let's apply it, and realize that there's other ways to do that.
I mean, Peary's one was about university students, so this is one that's trying to look at the adult lifespan, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yes.
And then, of course, there's Carol Gilligan's work.
Yes.
About the hierarchy of moral development premised entirely on a male worldview and her deconstruction of that, which, of course, has been around a very long time and would intersect quite interestingly with this kind of model.
Indeed, yeah. So for me, the piece of constructive development, if I can use that as a big, broader term, or social construction, is fascinating. How do we understand what's going on with individuals and, say, even groups, communities, via those things? I find that having a common language, if you will, is at least a helpful starting point to start having the conversations. But I agree there are tons of different ways to look at this. But I think with all of that said, where it gets most interesting is when we start thinking back to, say, white supremacy and dealing with individuals. So I read an article recently, Wall Street Journal, that was talking about the comparison of ISIS and white supremacy in the United States, which is a really lovely thing to, once again, to read about, like, wow, okay. But the author, I think, had some really great points, and the points being that in the United States, we treat terrorists and terrorists abroad like very well like another, and young white male shooters in the U.S. or people practicing white supremacy are ours, and we don't really want to deal with them. So we give them different labels than we would, say, external terrorists, which right there is a problem. If we start saying that our young white men that are doing these shootings have mental health problems, but the terrorists are radicals, not really good policy. So this is actually from an article, I suspect most of you have heard of the Southern Poverty Law Center. It's a great resource site. This comes from one of the articles from there. But this is actually, by the way, some recruitment language from that white supremacy group out of New Zealand. This is actually from their website. So
New Zealand one.
Yes, the New Zealand one. So my question, when you read these terms, does one of the orders just sort of kind of rise to you about who they might be speaking to?
Order.
Which order?
Third.
Okay. Why do you say third?
Because of all the belonging, the offer of a brotherhood and a nation.
Okay. Does everybody agree? Does it feel reasonable? This actually comes from, so I'm one of the managing co-editors for the Journal for Hate Studies. It's out of our Institute for Hate Studies at Gonzaga. This is one of the articles that will be published here online, free, in about 3 weeks. But she deconstructed Stormfront, which is an online white supremacy, was an online white supremacy site.
God, it's so complicated and crazy all at the same time.
Are you asking us a question about this?
Yeah. Well, where do you think it might land in the feet?
Somebody who can't think sensibly.
Somebody that what?
Somebody who is not capable of rational thought. I don't know.
For me, this raises an interesting question, which is that if you ask people where they fall on your hierarchy, everyone thinks they fall at the top. This person thinks they're doing some very sensible thinking.
Yes. Exactly.
And they're thinking beyond the institution and beyond, which for me calls into question the whole value judgment associated with the model to some extent, and particularly in line with the stats that you showed earlier. Essentially, we're sort of saying because we agree with the way this person thinks they're in the fifth order, but other people would think that they're in the fifth order, and that we're just stuck in our left-wing institutions, thinking like a third or fifth left-wing person, or whatever, which is kind of made stark by this.
Well, the reversal capacity, the only clan meeting I have ever been to.
You've been to one?
I have indeed been to a clan meeting. When I was in Yale Law School, I was part of the group that monitored the clan's incursions into Connecticut. And so we went to, at Meridian, we went to a clan gathering. And what was most noticeable about it was the fact that it wasn't about hate. over and over again, the message was, including the little clarinets and their full outfits, the children with their pointy hats and stuff, it was about, we are good, loyal, wonderful Americans. All we want is our right not to have to associate with black people or be part of them. The claiming of the high moral ground and the total reasonableness of their position. It was all about that. It wasn't about ranting, it wasn't about... and that was in the early 80s.
Sure.
So there's a long process of co-opting the position of reason to wherever you are.
Yeah, absolutely, and sort of to your comment too is human beings, we always overestimate ourselves. Would you agree?
I think studies would show that, yes.
Yeah, okay. So yes, if I were to ask people where they thought they felt in terms of Keegan, they usually actually say fourth and fifth order, somewhere in there. What I think is fascinating, back sort of to your point, is if I don't know much about something, but I want to feel better about where I'm at, and I meet with some kind of languaging around like this, I might start viewing this individual as an expert. It seems like if I am, say, anti-black or anti-Jew, then the rhetoric now becomes, that individual becomes, the expert or the teacher or the representative of the institution. So most of us would say this is not a very logical move or rant, but if I'm an individual that is in second order, I felt very isolated. The world is all about me. My needs are being oppressed. That might start making sense. If I'm part of an institution that says anti-Jew, anti-black, et cetera, then this would make sense to me.
Yeah, that's the thing. You're already exposed. It's not just like you're a blank slate. I mean, anybody who's going to be persuaded by that is already one white, identifies as white, already has a whole lot of knowledge about black and Jewish people as other to that, and the threat in some way or another has a kind of a sympathy with that. You'd have to have all that. It's not just about just being second order, because you could be second order and be different.
Sure.
From that, I would think.
You've got a conceptual filter through which it's all being read. There's the wonderful story about that was very prevalent, I think, was used perhaps by the Klan. It was used by the anti-school integration. There's a picture being used to persuade people that integration was a good thing, and it's of a little black boy outside a white school with tears dripping down his face. Obviously, he's crying because he's excluded, right? That's the filter. The counter reading by the white supremacists was this poor little boy is being forced to go to a white school where he doesn't want to go by these horrible integrationists. And I think it's a very good description of that the crudest form of that filter working.
I'm a little bit aware of time, but because we need to wrap up in 3 or 4 minutes. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. So here was just another one, but thank you for looking at the time. So this is all the same individual. It's also from the Stormfront site.
This is eugenics all over again.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Someone's just made an edit of all the times Trump has been referencing his great genes, his great German genes. Yeah. I mean, it's a thing for him. He really loves his genes over a long
What
period
about
of
his
time.
Scottish ones?
Doesn't mention them, but they have been they have stopped him from building his golf clubs.
One thing that kind of struck me as I was having a conversation with a highly educated white supremacist yesterday was just the sophistication and subtlety of his ideology and how it was working. And so I wonder, a kind of flip with this as well would be to say not just like what kind of people at what level are sucked in by hate, but the way in which those who are proponents of hate, which is hate is also just division and divisiveness as well, have escalated up they've kind of ratcheted up themselves in the sense that the forms of forms of legitimation of hate that we face today are often much more subtle than the earlier ones. So I'm just trying to flip this thing from the side of the person who's, person who's encountering hate ideology towards the sophistication of hate ideologies. Because
and you think they're also using, right? Those people could be, they're using it as a tool to power.
Yeah.
But that sophistication's always in wars, isn't it? I mean, it's exactly what happens when the enemy is constituted so that the soldiers can go off and kill without experiencing complete collapse because they're breaking all the moral rules that they've grown up with. And that's again,
So
it has to be sophisticated.
some of this post-conventional kind of stuff gets you, I mean,
So
I
actually,
don't know, the white supremacist I was talking to yesterday was like, he's telling me about the story. Oh, in the olden days, kids used to play in really crazy playgrounds above the concrete. Now they're all kind of mollycoddled, and this kind of story that we hear. And I mean, to me, that's really redolent of a kind of set of ideologies that developed that's in Europe in the late 19th century. That this idea that when there's no longer any great people anymore, which is the basis of
the loss of the Übermensch.
Yeah, which is the basis of Nietzsche's particular form of fascism, and that kind of idea that there's no longer any great, and we're hearing these stories, and that, so that I think that post-conventionalism can be, because convention becomes always this restriction on our freedoms, and now, so I just think this forms of ideology that we're faced with is so sophisticated now, it's like hard to know. Yeah,
Hates
and
freedom.
the dog whistling and all that kind of stuff, it's like there's little signs, but it's all hidden and.
I kind of, listening to you, I was thinking maybe there needs to be, the trouble is you're talking to a bunch of sociologists, and this is a very psychological model.
Yes.
And it's one thing, but doing some of this, testing of this with white supremacists, you're sort of suggesting that some of them are quite sophisticated thinkers.
Yeah.
So, maybe there are some fifth order, if you want to go there.
Or maybe sophisticated in terms of hiding the hate. I mean, is that what you...
Yeah, it's almost like they self-consciously know
Hiding
that
the hate.
they're going to be exposed for hate, for their divisiveness, because that's what they're doing. So they kind of like fend that off and like, oh no, I didn't mean to say such and such. I just meant to say that, why can't you let kids just play in the mud and blah, blah, blah anymore.
It's back to I have a good reason, and it's really just a very simple thing, and you're making it complicated and ominous, where really, and it's like saying, I just want my rights. It's another part of that.
Yeah.
That kind of claiming the normal, claiming that this is how people really are, and that anybody who is objecting to it is in fact undermining the resilience and glorious independence of the human individual.
And then we as the critics, we are the conventionalists who are just stuck in our kind of
Too scared to be anything else.
You're too scared,
Yeah. One of my doc students and I are actually going to do some research along this line in terms of, so most of you probably know of incels. The red pill incels are a very specific segment of them, and there are, anyway.
The red pill. It's the right.
Yeah.
Okay. Right, themselves.
Yes. So we're going to do some research with some folks that have left the incels, and try to deconstruct it a little bit through this lens. Let's see.
That will be both horrendous and fascinating.
Yes. Yes, it will. Thankfully, they've left, and hopefully can help us understand why they left, but why they were drawn in the first place. And I suspect, thank you for being here. Have a good day. Some of these folks online that kind of do these kinds of rants, to I think Campbell's point is, we haven't studied the dark side of fourth, fifth order, and I'm very curious if, it's not to say that anybody's all moralistic if they're in fourth order by any means. Some.
It's the leaders and the followers, isn't it? The followers might be down there in third order, but the leaders might not be.
Right.
But then you didn't present this as a moral order as such, did you?
No, I didn't.
And that I'm very aware of that.
I think just for the sake of time, I know other people are trying to get off
Yes,
the show. Maybe
yes.
can we thank him?
Yeah.
And then
Thank you all for being here. Appreciate your time in the busy semester.